reading is the biggest gap in your education. Why? Because going through all the education that you have gone through, there is not a single class that teaches you how to read. And as a result of that, have you ever noticed that sometimes you read a book and you don't quite remember it after you've read it? Or you're in the middle of the book and you don't quite remember the first chapter. Or you know that you've read a book before and you really enjoyed the book, and as you were reading it, the information, the content was really relevant to you. But for some reason, when you need it, you can't recall what was talked about in the book. So in this video, what I want to share with you are all the secrets to expert readers. How do you retain what you read, and how do you read in such a way that you can activate your genius? I went to a high school that I felt as a teenager that was very limited in its educational content. It was in a very small village in the middle of nowhere, a rural village, and the teachers were members of the community. And I always felt that I was not getting a quality education. I had big dreams to go to really good colleges after high school, and I felt like I had to take matters into my own hands. So one day I woke up and my parents had bought a box full of encyclopedias. Encyclopedias that looked like this, and you can imagine they had from A to Z. There was a dictionary from A to P and from Q to Z, and there was A to Z, all physical encyclopedias, because this was before Google, before search engines. And I was very curious, and every day I would pick a letter of the alphabet and I would pore over its pages, learning everything I could in those encyclopedias from A to Z, and even those two dictionaries as well. And this is where I really realized that if I wanted to carry out my mission in terms of education, I really felt I needed to take matters into my own hands. And thus is the case if you've graduated from college, if you've got your degrees, your education does not stop. Continuous learning is really important. So at some point, we need to wake up and be committed to take education into our own hands. Because if you were to go back to continuous learning and get another degree, go back to school again, and offload the education to someone else, the curriculum, the professors, oftentimes they still don't teach you how to read. And if we don't solve that problem in the gap of our education, we continue not to be able to retain what we learned. So what I want to share with you are just some really quick and hidden secrets that I've discovered in my journey of learning on how I can still remember the things that I've read, including encyclopedias and including textbooks like this during my PhD. I still remember what I have read in this book that was one of my textbooks in graduate school. Secret number one. The first secret in reading retention and activating your genius is to be intentional about what you read. I know out there they've got things like the New York Times bestseller. You walk into a bookstore and they have the editor's recommended list. They have the top sellers or the bestsellers list or things like that. This is somebody else's curated list. When you choose your reading material, it's really important that you choose based on your values and based on your goals, not based on someone else's list. It's very captivating to pick from the bestsellers and read those books because they're very popular. Most of the time, when you pick from popular books, they aren't structured in a way and the content isn't written in such a way that it really deepens your understanding, or it really deepens your wisdom and availability of critical thinking. So the first secret that I've discovered is to be intentional, to curate my own reading list, not based on someone else's criteria. So ask yourself, what are your goals for reading? What have you identified your gaps to be? What is most inspiring to you to be able to discover in the moment? And what are some knowledge bases that you want to expand upon? Where do you see your future going? And how do you want to bridge that gap between where you are and where you want to be through education? So I spend time reflecting upon these goals that are truly and uniquely mine, but they're inspirational to me. They really are aligned with my life purpose and mission. So that is the first secret. The second secret, I have noticed that not every book is written the same. Not all books are identical. Now, I just showed you two examples of books. We have encyclopedias. This is a type of book. We have textbooks. Now, not all textbooks are this thick, but textbooks, which is valuable data, researched and proven principles. So there are textbooks, and then there are regular books. Just to keep it simple, let's put these couple of categories in there, right? And I'm not talking about genres of books, by the way. I'm just talking about different types of reading material. So in other words, you have regular books, you have reference materials, and then you have the encyclopedia, which is generalized topic across different domains. Okay, so understand that not all books are created equal. So here's what I mean by that. When there is a book that was written as an encyclopedia, the essence of an encyclopedia, versus a book that was written as reference material, or a regular book, which is written around a specialized topic, your approach to reading is different. So here's what I mean by that. If I were to buy a book from the bookstore and it was an encyclopedia, now, or it was a textbook, sometimes I still buy textbooks, I may not necessarily read them cover to cover, chapter by chapter. I will read them in terms of reference, in terms of sometimes answering one question that I have in the moment, or answering or closing one gap in my knowledge that I have identified through my own thought process. So that's how I approach books like that. If it is one book on a topic, I'm very intentional about choosing it, and in those instances, I will read them cover to cover. I will read them chapter by chapter, but not necessarily taking the time to read it word for word. Right? So the approach is different depending on the author's intention for the book. Chances are, if an author was writing a textbook, the intention of it is as a reference and not to read it cover to cover. So then you set your intention by choosing the type of reading material that will best serve your goals, and then you go in there approaching it, matching your approach to what that reference material, what that reading material was intended to be. Right? So that's the second secret. The third secret, now this is the most important one for retention. In our brain, and as you know, I'm holding a book on principles of neuroscience because my education was in neuroscience and understanding the brain through behaviors and the brain in disease. So the way that our memories work, when we learn something new or when we're exposed to something for the first time, that's like the first draft, the first exposure to it. 24 hours later, it is understood that we retain half or less than half of what we've just first exposed ourselves to, right? And that's kind of, you can think of it as kind of like called the forgetting curve, the opposite of the learning curve. There's the forgetting curve. So what we're up against is this forgetting curve. And one of the most important skills to develop is the skill of reflecting on what you've just heard, reflecting on what you've just learned. Now, if it is a reference book like this, now, I don't necessarily read this cover to cover. I did when I was in college, but that was because I had an exam to write. But these days, when I pick up a textbook and I buy textbooks, I don't read them to cover. I'm just reading them to answer one question. When I have sourced that question and I have researched it using that textbook, when I close the book, I will reflect on what I've just exposed myself to. I will reflect on what I just read. And I reflect on it at certain intervals after I've closed the book. So that's with textbooks. Now, with regular books, you can see on the side how I have put tabs here. So I put tabs here because there was a certain concept or there was a principle that I extrapolated through the text that was very interesting to me. And whenever I put a tab there, it is to let me know that that's something I want to reflect on further. I want to carry out the thought process further. I want to reflect on things that come up for me in my critical thinking on that area that I just read. So then wherever I have tabs, when I'm finished my reading event and I close the book and I'm done for that moment, at a very short period of time afterwards, it could be 30 minutes afterwards or an hour afterwards, I will think through one of those tabs that I just read, and this is in my regular thinking time. So then when you start to, through regular intervals after your reading event in less than 24 hours, I give myself recollection exposures. It doesn't mean I read the passage again. I've finished reading, but I reflect it in my mind, and that helps you with retention in the long term. And this is the most important process in my reading process that allows me to remember books and textbooks that I've read 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even in high school. Right, so this is the third secret. And the fourth and final secret in terms of retaining what you've read and being able to build a knowledge and insight around what you just read. Now remember earlier I mentioned the tabs that I put into books that I've read, and then I reflect upon those. Now when I am intentionally sitting down to reflect and think about those concepts that I want to dive deeper into, I start to take notes on my thoughts. Take notes on my thoughts. So this is really different from what they teach you in school. In school, they hand you a textbook, and then the teacher is in front of the classroom writing notes, and then you write down exactly what the teacher says. Or you might open the textbook and you take notes on the textbook, or it's like kind of like copy pasting what the book says, right? And so this is what most people do. They take notes on what the teacher said or what the author said. And this is really difficult to retain if you think about it, because those weren't your words, it was theirs. And it's really hard to remember verbatim what someone else said. So instead of writing down what someone else wrote or writing down what someone else said, I write down my own thoughts during my reflection on what I just heard or read. This is the most important step. So what happens, and I've been doing this for a long time, okay, so what happens now is that I have pages and pages. I have chapters and chapters. In fact, I can fill a whole encyclopedia of my own thoughts, my own insights that are fully developed because I took the time in thinking to develop them. So those are my secret hacks, my 4 secret hacks to reading and retaining what you know and developing deep insights through it, so you never run out of something to say and you always have something insightful to say. I trust you found these 4 hacks helpful to you, but remember, knowing a thing is not the same as to being able to do that thing. So what have you heard here today? And what are you going to implement right now in your reading journey? I want to hear from you. What is the biggest takeaway that you have learned from the secrets from a reader to develop your genius? What are you going to implement today? How have you been already doing it? And what changes specifically are you going to make to change the way that you read and retain the information? I want to hear from you.